Good afternoon. Welcome to our afternoon colloquium. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Oliver Cossairt, who is an assistant professor at the Northwestern University. Before joining Northwestern, he graduated from Columbia, got his PhD, and received the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship for his thesis work on theoretical limits of computational imaging. And now Professor Cossairt heads the Computational Photography Lab at Northwestern Universities, whose research consists of a diverse portfolio of topics ranging from optics photonics, computer graphics, computer vision, and image processing. He has written several high-impact publications in reputed journals like ACM SIGGRAPH, IEEE Pattern Analysis and Machine Intelligence, and he's an associate editor of the IEEE Journal on Computational Imaging, which I believe is a new journal.
Yes, submit your papers to TCI.
So that's a plug for that, and he has a very diverse, I suppose, distribution of funding ranging from Office of Naval Research, NIH, DOE, and he's received the NSF Carrier Award for his research work. And I think with that, I'll pass on to Professor Cossairt. He's going to be talking about computational imaging and illumination for 3D acquisition.
Great, thank you, Amit, and thank you for inviting me to come and give this lecture. It's great to be here. So I have been working in the optics communities, both academic and industrial, for about over a decade. And of course, I've known about the College of Optical Sciences here for that entire time. And this is the first chance I've been able to come and visit. So it's a great privilege to be here. This is a pretty generic title. The main idea here is I'm going to sort of give you a sprinkling of some of the different projects that are going on in my lab to give you a flavor mainly of the diversity of, I realize I'm touching out with my fingers, of the types of things that we're working on. This is some work with a lot of different collaborators. So Mohit Gupta shows up on a lot of this. There's a long list of people here. Some of these are people in my lab, Sheng Huang, Quan He, and then some of them are collaborators from people at places like museums. So Mark Walton, Mary Broadway. I'll talk about that work, some work that's in collaboration with the Art Institute. And then some other professors at Northwestern University, Jack Tumblin and Agalos Katsegelos in graphics and image processing, respectively. So I'm going to talk about computational imaging and illumination, and the main theme is going to be about systems that use photos captured with different illumination types of settings, together with camera systems that have implicitly computational processing of the sensed images that are being captured. And the idea is that in my lab, we sort of look at this all as holistically as possible, thinking about this from a system perspective of how do we get the software algorithms and the optical instruments to work together as closely as possible to get the best performance. So I'll talk about this in three different contexts. So the first context I'll talk about is this motion contrast 3D scanning system, which is this new take on a very old technique. Essentially one of the first 3D capture techniques out there, point-based 3D scanning, triangulation-based systems. I'll talk about that first. And then I'll talk about these surface shape studies that we did of the art of Paul Gauguin. And this is part of a collection of works that we've done in collaboration with museums and conservators around the world. This particular collaboration was with the Art Institute of Chicago. And I'll talk about some of the work that we did for that. And then we'll get into this compressed sensing-based phase retrieval stuff. This is work that is more recent, that is done. The intention is to actually apply this work to high-energy X-ray imaging at the Advanced Photon Source at Argonne National Labs. We've done some preliminary experiments and simulations that I will show you about that and talk to you about directions that we're headed with that. And if I have time, we'll see. I might try to fit in one last project down here on macroscopic Fourier topography. I'll explain, if I have time, what that is and what we're doing with that. Okay, so I'll start off talking about motion contrast 3D scanning. Okay, and the idea here at its core is pretty simple. Okay, so the idea is that we have some kind of laser scanning system. So we have a point or a set of patterns that we're projecting onto the scene that are changing sequentially with time, and we're capturing images for each of those different point locations, for instance, that we're scanning across the scene. And if we're doing point scanning in particular, there's many different flavors of different types of scanning. But for point scanning, if we have an image that's m by n pixels and we're moving a point across each location in the image, we have to capture a lot of data. Okay? So we need to capture m times n images for all the different locations that we're scanning across the scene. So the core idea that we're trying to get at here with this project is, how do you take this set of data that you're capturing here and condense it down to something much more compact, which is to say that each instant that you're scanning this point across the scene, you just record, instead of recording an entire image, you just record the data which tells you the location of that point as it's being scanned across the scene. And if you can do that, if you can come up with a sensing mechanism to achieve this, then you only need m times n measurements total. Okay? These aren't pixel brightness measurements anymore. These are physical XY locations on the sensor now. So it's a little bit more data. But in general, m times n measurements as a total, as opposed to needing m squared times n squared measurements for the traditional photometric-based technique that you would typically use for this type of a scanning system. So that's the core high-level idea. And we want to apply it to 3D capture. Okay? And just taking a broad step back about thinking about what our options are, we could go with a passive system. So passive systems such as two-view stereo systems or depth from focus, defocus types of methods. And these systems are great because you don't need any active illumination. And for certain types of scenes, they work extremely well. But, excuse me, they are scene dependent. Okay, so they require some sort of texture in the scene to be able to establish correspondence between multiple views, or to get a focus measure that can tell you very accurately what the depth in your scene is. And so for that reason, we look to active 3D capture methods. And the most basic type of active 3D capture method is a 3D scanner, a laser scanner. So the laser scanner uses the same scenario that I showed in the previous slide, where you have a laser, either point or a line that moves across the scene. And then you have another camera that looks at where that point projects to on the other sensor. And then using triangulation, okay, you've established a correspondence between your projector pixel that you projected and where it maps to on your sensor. You can do triangulation to compute the 3D location of that scene point. Okay? And active 3D scanning methods, there's a large taxonomy of them. Okay, so laser scanning is just one type of method. Another type of method is, for instance, the technique that's used in the original Kinect. So the Kinect version 1, it's a projector camera system. It's non-scanning. Okay, so you project a pattern that's just a static pattern, and then with your camera, you image how that pattern gets warped onto 3D surfaces, and you go into your image and you look at how the object is warped, and that gives you some notion of the orientation of the 3D structure of that object. There's also, you can lump into these active methods the second version of the Kinect. The second version of Kinect uses so-called time-of-flight principles. So it uses a temporally modulated illumination source and a temporally modulated detector, essentially a correlation detector that that is sort of simulating interferometric effects using much lower frequencies, more like megahertz range techniques, and using amplitude modulation instead of electric field modulation. So the time-of-flight techniques are different from the triangulation-based techniques. The time-of-flight techniques, again, this would be like the Kinect 2 type of sensor, if you're familiar with that, or many other commercial sensors now using the same principle. The depth calculations are based on the total time of travel from the source to the object back to the detector. Okay? These other techniques on the left-hand side, both the stereo methods, whether they're depth and focus, or the other structure light methods, those are triangulation-based techniques. So the depth is calculated based on essentially parallax information between your camera and your projector. So I'm not going to talk anymore about time-of-flight techniques. I'm really going to focus more on these triangulation-based techniques for this portion of the talk. And the point is you can get pretty high resolution. So this is an example of a commercial laser scanner system that was used for the Digital Michelangelo project. And in this case, they were doing a very large statue. So this is, a 2 or 3 meter large statue, and they were getting sub millimeter precision on this. So you can get very high precision with these triangulation-based techniques, specifically at closer ranges, where the ratio between the baseline and the distance to the object is small. Okay. Okay. So. A bit of a taxonomy of different sort of structured illumination methods. So on the one hand, upper left-hand corner, we have a typical laser scanning type system. This could be either a point scanning system, or this could be a cross-section for a line scan type system. So we have a laser projector that projects either a point or a line as it moves across the scene. Okay? And then we have a camera which is able to identify which pixel column or pixel location, really, that projected pixel from the projector maps to on the sensor. Okay, so we establish a disparity between which column we project to on the projector and which column it gets mapped to on the camera. And that's done by establishing a correspondence. And then based on the disparity information, we can compute depth. Okay, so the laser scanning system is slow. You have to capture a different image for each different location of the line or the point source. You can get around this problem by using structured illumination methods that use projectors. So if you use a projector, you can use a gray coding scheme, which essentially allows you to assign a binary code, a binary sequence, to each different column that you're projecting in your projector. Okay? So that when you capture an image in your camera, that each pixel will measure a code, a sequence of zeros and ones. Did the light get projected to this point or not? That uniquely identifies which projector column that light came from. Okay? And as a result, because you're doing this binary encoding, you can make measurements much faster. So for your laser projector, if you have a line scanning projector, it's going to take, and you're capturing a megapixel image, it's going to take 1,000 images for each of the different locations of the point scan. For the gray coding system, it's logarithmic, essentially. So you could do it in 10 images. So not quite real time. If you switch to a fringe or phase shifting based method, you can theoretically get it down to just 3 images. However, in this case, you're essentially introducing amplitude modulation to help you try to essentially disambiguate correspondences between projector pixels and camera pixels. So you're getting closer to real time. And then there's these single shot methods, which would be where you just project a single image. It has some, projects something like a speckle pattern, and then you see how it deforms around an object. And then you sort of make these piecewise smooth assumptions to try to come up with a best guess for what the object depth is. So these tend to be lower quality depth maps, but they can be done at very high speeds. Okay, so there's a continuum between these methods. We're essentially moving from left to right. We're getting faster and faster. But there's also a trade-off between how well these different techniques work in particularly challenging 3D capture scenarios. So in particular, if we look at the problem of noise from ambient light, okay? So in all of these systems, these are active systems, so we're projecting light out into the scene, and all that we want to measure is the light that went from our source and then reflected off the object and then came back to our detector. But we're always going to have competing light sources coming from ambient illumination in the scene, overhead lighting. For outdoors, we have to compete with the sun and the extremely bright source. So here's a comparison between laser scanning and gray coding, okay, where we are our baseline is that we're fixing the total amount of optical power. So we just have a source with some amount of optical power, and we're just deciding whether or not to distribute it across the scene to produce some sort of a gray code, a binary stripe pattern, or we take all the light and we concentrate it to just a point source. This is going to take a lot slower to capture all the data we need to get 3D information. This is going to be a lot faster. However, there's an implication in the way that we've chose to spread out our light, which comes into play when we look at what happens when we have ambient illumination in the scene. So here's an example, ideal lab scenario where you can block all the background light. Real world scenario where you have to compete with actual other illumination sources such as overhead lighting or the sun. Okay? And the issue is that basically for all these techniques there's essentially a thresholding step. Okay? So there's a thresholding step where we say, okay, if the pixel gets light that's over some threshold, that's an indication that that's where the line mapped to for this particular row. Okay? And that threshold step is trivial if you have no background light. If you have background light, then depending how intense the background light is relative to your source, you can still pick some other threshold, raise your threshold value up, and you can still get a correct binarization. For the gray coding system, again, we took all of our power, we spread it over the whole scene. If we're in an essentially noiseless scenario in our lab where we can turn off all other background sources, it's not a problem. But if we go out in the real world and we start to play around with changing where this threshold value is going to be, we're going to get essentially binary misassignment errors where things that should have been dark are no longer dark because the background light filled in those areas. Okay? So this is a real problem. And it shows up not just in this specific case of looking at the problem of noise from background illumination, but it also shows up in just sort of structural problems in reconstructing 3D surfaces. So here's an example of a relatively simple shape. So it's just a book. Okay, so this is a wedge, a V-shaped groove. This is an example of the ideal case, the very simplified optical model where light goes from the source, it bounces off of the object, and then comes back to the camera. That's not a realistic optical model. In reality, light goes, bounces off the object, and then it has the possibility to keep bouncing off of the object before it gets to the camera. Okay? This is something that's referred to in the graphics community as global illumination, as opposed to just direct light that directly reflects off of the object and goes back to the camera. Global illumination is light that bounces off the object and then bounces off the object one or more times before it gets back to the camera. And this has the same sort of problems. Okay, so again, if you have a laser scanning system, okay, if you're ignoring global illumination, you do just fine. When you have global illumination, it turns out there's some really nice guarantees. You can still find a good threshold that allow you to give you the correct binarization. Well, that property goes away when you start to use these patterns that spread all your energy across the scene. Again, it works in the ideal setting, but in the practical setting where you're actually looking at more realistic optical propagation, you get the same sort of problems where light bounces around and it fills in areas that should have been dark. And when you mess around trying to play around with this, where this threshold should be, some of the things that you expected to be bright are now dim, and everything gets messed up. And all of those errors propagate to depth errors. Okay? So these are challenging problems for 3D capture. And you can sort of plot some of these problems on these sort of axes that we've come up with to look at essentially the design of 3D capture systems, specifically in structured light, triangulation-based 3D capture systems. So we have acquisition speed, resolution, and light efficiency. And laser scanning, you can get very nice high-resolution results, okay? But they're very slow, but they're very light efficient. So they work in these challenging scenarios, such as where you have strong background light, or you have very concave objects where the light bounces around a lot internally. Gray coding systems, they fall over here because they're faster, okay? And they can give you high-resolution results, but they're not nearly as light efficient as laser scanning, okay? Phase shifting or fringe projection is similar to that. And then single-shot methods fall over here because they essentially give you lower resolution. They introduce smoothness constraints. They don't give you the same information as the other techniques. And there's hybridizations between these different methods. Essentially, methods that trade off between gray coding and laser scanning based on the characteristics of the scene, or methods that trade off between single shot and gray coding, again, depending on the amount of motion in the scene. And we want to get something out here. So that's what we're looking at for this project, is how do we get something. This would be an ideal maximally efficient system that's light efficient, high resolution, and fast. So that's what we were looking at trying to develop. And that's where we started looking at a different type of sensing principle than is traditionally used, at least for our digital sensors. So a typical digital sensor, a digital photosensor, would take some time-varying photon flux coming from any number of sources. Okay, it would convert it to a time-varying voltage or current that then would be sampled periodically by an analog to digital converter. Okay, for our the type of sensing that we were looking at is based on this idea of motion contrast sensing. And this is a biologically inspired sensing paradigm where you have a time-varying photon flux, okay, that gets converted to a time-varying voltage or current. And then internally, in an analog sense, this time-varying analog voltage or current gets differentiated. And then we look at when this time derivative exceeds some thresholded value. And only in that specific case do we send out a specific event information that tells us we have useful data. And the point here is that this is a natural compression mechanism. So we do not sample data when it's not telling us anything useful. Okay? And so this is used by the human visual system and other biological vision systems. Basically, photoreceptor response. You may or may not know this, but it's photoreceptors in the retina don't respond to constant stimulus. Okay, so the reason why we are continuously perceiving things are essentially micro saccade motions, which make it so that no individual photoreceptor is always seeing the same thing at any instant, one instant to the next. But internally, this same mechanism happens inside of the human visual system, inside of our retina, before pulses are sent down via the optical cortex, via the optic nerve to the visual cortex. And it's, again, a compression mechanism. So when things aren't changing in our field of view, we don't need to send signals to the brain. Okay? And so that's what we're going to exploit here. And fortunately for us, this has been implemented in silicon. So there's a company that is an offshoot of EPL Zurich that is called INI Labs that has made a sensor with this kind of a pixel. So this is a block diagram, high-level description of what a pixel on the sensor looks like. Okay, so there's a logarithmic photoreceptor, so incoming photon flux gets converted to time-varying voltage with a logarithmic mapping. Okay, there's a circuit, an analog circuit that takes the time-varying voltage and it differentiates it, essentially sort of subtracting a low-pass filtered version of the signal. And then that gets sent through a threshold mechanism that gets asynchronously polled to see when this threshold is exceeded, in which case an event is fired, which sends a piece of data from the sensor to the camera, which tags the time of the firing and the pixel location that the firing happened at. So that's a sensing paradigm. And here's a result, a sort of comparison between what a video would look like captured with a motion contrast camera versus a conventional video camera. And the idea here is that we're looking at the same bandwidth, the same number of pixels per second coming off of the sensor. For the conventional video system, we're sampling all of these pixels where the brightnesses aren't changing. We're sampling them each frame. Whereas for the motion contrast camera, we're only providing samples when there is a brightness change. And as a result, you can tell for this one, we're getting much finer temporal resolution, whereas this one we're only getting essentially a couple frames of fully dense video. Here we're getting many, many frames, very high temporal resolution, but very few spatial events. So we're essentially trading off between spatial and temporal resolution here for the same amount of fixed bandwidth. And so our idea is basically just to use this sensor in a laser scanning system. It's a very simple idea. Okay? So we have a laser projector. Okay, we're sequencing through each of the columns or each of the pixel locations in our projector. And then we replaced our conventional camera with a motion contrast camera. Okay? And so we know we've calibrated our projector, so we know essentially which pixel column or pixel location is projected as a function of time. And then what comes out of the motion contrast camera is it tells us essentially which pixel this is being mapped to on the motion contrast camera at which time. Okay? So we get basically a plot like this, which tells us at time 1 we get mapped to column 1, time 2, column 2, and so on. Okay? And so now we have essentially disparity information. We know correspondences between, for a given time instant, we know which projector pixel was turned on and which camera pixel it was mapped to. And because this is a very small amount of data, this can be read out very fast. And we can turn up the speed of our projector to be at real-time rates. Okay? So, we can use the timing information to make a disparity map. And from the disparity map and from the extrinsic properties, the rotation and location of the camera and projector relative to each other, we can make a 3D model. And the real advantage of this is that in the same amount of time that it takes to do a full scan of an entire 3D depth map for our MC3D system, that's the same amount of time it would take to read out a single frame of an equivalent sensor for, in this case, a line scanning sensor. So it would take n times longer to sequence through all of the different scan locations for a conventional laser scanner compared to our system. And really the reason is because we're making all these measurements with our laser scanner where there's no useful information. There's a bunch of black pixels. We have to read those pixels anyway because that's just the internal architecture of the conventional focal plane sensing paradigm. In this case, if we switch to a different sensing paradigm, we can get much more efficient use of our bandwidth. So this is our prototype. This is a microvision pico projector. This is a MEMS-based projector. So what it does is it takes a single laser, points it onto a MEMS mirror that raster scans the scene, and then you intensity modulate the laser as you're moving across points in the scene. So that's perfect for us. That's exactly what we wanted. So it scans at approximately 60 frames per second, and that we just couple that with our motion contrast sensor from INI Labs. So this is some results here. So here's our MC3D system, and then here is a laser scan system. And so you can see we can getting very close to ground truth results. This is a comparison between our system and the first version of the Kinect, which again uses triangulation as opposed to time of flight information. Here's real-time performance. So a coin spinning at 30 frames per second. And then comparison between a pinwheel spinning for, again, the MC3D and the Kinect 1. So the real advantage of the technique is its performance with large amounts of background radiation. Here's some initial experiments that we did, which basically show that, relative to essentially given the same amount of power, we can go out to, somewhere between 4, 5, 6 times as much light as the original Kinect. The main thing that's interesting here is that in this case, the illumination is 1/10 the power of or 1/10 the amount of irradiance that's being received from background illumination in this case. These were just initial experiments. We've developed a second prototype, second generation prototype, which is actually so efficient that we can make a 3D scan of a light bulb as it's on. So this is a 3D depth map giving you 3D information of this light bulb from the light that's being projected from this scanner onto this light bulb that light is competing with the light being emitted from the light bulb, which is many, many orders of magnitude brighter, and we can still get 3D depth information from that. So the whole goal here is to be able to do active 3D scanning, dense 3D scanning outdoors. So this is the type of scenario that we're looking at. So we want to do a bright day, so 80 to 100 kilolux. That's about as bright as it gets. And we want to do several meters distances. So in this case, this example is 4 meters away. And in this example, we're just going to have a person, and this is Nathan Matsuda, the lead on this project. And we're just going to do a 3D scan of him in front of the camera. Okay? And this is the results. So on the left, this is the Connect. Now, this is the Connect 2. The Connect 2 has better outdoor performance than the Connect 1. But we're able to show here we're getting much better 3D capture results using our 3D scanner than with the Connect 2. So for the Connect 2, we're dropping a lot of pixels. The fields of view aren't perfectly matched here, but you get the main idea that we're capturing pretty dense 3D information here, and we're losing a lot of information for the Connect 2. So we think this is a pretty competitive 3D scanning technique, and we've essentially started a spin-off startup company to try to commercialize this, and we're looking at different applications right now. There's some other nice advantages. So this is an example of that V-groove. So this is a book that's open like this, and this is the profile that we're able to recover, and this is a conventional structured illumination gray coding technique that totally falls apart because light's bouncing around back and forth near where the grooves meet each other. Because it's a logarithmic sensor, it works very well for reflective materials, so we can pretty faithfully recover the 3D shape of this shiny sphere, whereas, again, other structured illumination techniques are going to fail due to these bright specular reflections that cause saturations in the images that you capture. Okay. So that was a little bit about 3D scanning. And now I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about some work which is very different in nature. So this is work collaborating with artists, conservation, conservators and art historians at museums. Okay? And in this particular problem, we were looking at, we were interested in doing measurements of prints and drawings housed at the Art Institute of Chicago, and we wanted to make quantitative surface measurements of these prints and drawings. And the goal was to basically look closer at this large collection of works of Paul Gauguin at the Art Institute of Chicago. And he has a lot of works that are not as well known as his paintings, which are pretty famous, from watercolor, woodblock prints, monotypes to oil transfers. There's just a large diversity of the different types of printed materials and transferred drawings that he did. And that was the subject of this study. In particular, we paid close attention to this one painting called Nativity. This is the front, and then this is the back. Okay? And because there are these markings on the back, one possible hypothesis of the way that the print was made was using something called a monotype. And a monotype is basically the most basic type of print that you can make. So you draw on the back. Okay? You put the piece of paper down on an inked surface. You draw on the back. The locations where you apply pressure on the back with a pencil, ink is transferred onto the front of the paint. And you essentially get a line that gives you something on the front where ink has been transferred. And that's your drawing. Okay? The most basic type of transfer that you can make. And at first, it was hypothesized that this was probably the technique that was used to make this particular print. However, there were some questions that conservators had about this print. In particular, if you look sort of closely, there are these places where it looks like there's these lines that are broken, where the ink has not been deposited. And those were referred to as blind incisions. And what was hypothesized was that basically, in the same way that if you have a pad of paper and you draw on the top, and then you remove the top pad, there will still be indentations on the bottom. That was the hypothesis here, is that there was actually surface indentations that were causing essentially these little valleys where ink was not able to be deposited. Okay? So that's really the thing that they were interested in looking at. And there's some other visual observations that you can make. So for instance, you can tell that there's multiple colors of pencils that were used on the back to trace the ink during the transfer process. And you can also get a sense that on the front that there are two separate types of ink, and there is a layering process which gives an indication that there was more than one transfer of ink that happened at a time. Okay, so that gets us to what we were trying to do. And so the question that we were interested in looking at is can we add to the quantitative information available to these conservators and art historians to help them interpret these works of art. So they wanted to know how Gauguin made these prints because they were made very late in his life, close to when he passed away, and when he was essentially a recluse on the Tahitian Islands and was not documenting at all how he was making these pieces. So there was his technique was unknown. Okay? And so they wanted to try to uncover more information about this. So how did we make surface measurements? We used a technique called photometric stereo. And in photometric stereo, you capture a sequence of photographs from a fixed camera location. And then you use a light source from a known orientation. And you move it around to different directions. And then you use those set of brightness values that you measured at each pixel to determine the orientation of the surface at each pixel. Okay? And this is the data that we captured. Okay? So these are a set of photographs from different illumination angles, and you can tell that they're different illumination angles because we have a reflective ball here, which is showing a highlight, which indicates what the normal direction of the light coming into the print is. And the goal of the work was basically to be able to look at the surface structure of this print without being encumbered by the pigment on top of the print. So the idea was to try to sort of computationally remove the pigment from the surface structure to just visualize the surface structure by itself. And so this is the kind of things that we're able to see. So if we look closer at this region here, so this is one of the figures with their arm over her head, and this is some of the hair that has been drawn out. And if we remove the pigment and we just start to visualize the surface structure, we can start to see some lines that are actually sticking out of the page. So we can tell that these are essentially protrusions from the page, which again is an indication that pressure was applied from the back of the print so that contact was made on the front of the print to an ink surface where the ink was transferred. Again, an indication that this was indeed a monotype transfer process that was used to produce these prints. However, when we looked at this this is a particular example where we have a lot of different blind incisions. When we look at the surface structure for this, oops. Uh-oh. I think you're going to have to give me a second here to, yeah. Oh, so it didn't crash. That's a good sign. Okay. So yeah, so when we look at the surface structure, when we peel the pigment away and just look at the surface structure by itself, we don't see any sort of information where those broken lines are. So basically, we're able to verify that this hypothesis that these features in the print came from blind incisions was false. And as a result, it led to the conservators coming up with this alternate theory of how the prints were made. And so the idea is that if you map out all of these broken lines, that was the ink surface that was used at the start of the transfer process. So this is sort of the simulation they came up with. So first you start off with an ink surface that's evenly, ink is evenly distributed. You put a piece of paper down and you draw on the back. And then you now have a monotype. You remove it, and you throw that piece of paper away. Okay, so Gauguin would have put that somewhere. That print is probably floating around somewhere in some collection somewhere. But now we have an ink surface where some of the ink has been removed. And this is now the beginning of the print that we're looking at, this nativity print. So we now put down a fresh piece of paper. We draw on the back. And when we pull it up, we get an ink transfer where many of the lines are broken because there was ink that was removed from the original ink surface, okay, from that first monotype that we threw away. And then there's a second application of ink that's removed. And this is the results and the comparison with the ground truth. So this would be the print surface and the back surface where you make the drawings to transfer the ink from the surface onto the print. Okay? And the art historians were pretty happy with this reproduction technique. They felt like it was a pretty faithful explanation of the technique that Gauguin used. Okay, so we talked about 3D scanning. Okay, 3D scanning outdoors. We talked about 3D capture for prints and drawings for museums. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is about this problem of phase retrieval or lensless imaging. And the idea here is that this is connected to problems in X-ray diffraction. So in X-ray, it's very difficult and expensive to build any type of optics. In fact, you can't build refractive or reflective optics. They have to be diffraction-based. It's done, and if you go to one of these very impressive facilities like the Advanced Photon Source at Argonne, there's all sorts of optical elements that are used in X-ray paths. But in general, the problem of X-ray detection usually boils down to a problem of measuring a diffracted intensity field, usually a Fraunhofer diffraction pattern. Okay, so essentially the Fourier transform of the object intensity that you're interested in. You measure only the squared magnitude of that field. And you have to figure in, the goal is to go backwards to the object field from intensity-only measurements. Okay. But if you can do it, you can do very10 imaging. So these are some examples: biological yeast cells. Getting 110 tenths of nanometer resolution is a typically done all the time in these sorts of experiments. So you can do very high resolution imaging, but these. There's a problem that pops up a lot in these X-ray experiments, which is that because X-rays are highly forward scattering, you tend to get very large intensity at the center of your diffraction pattern. Essentially, you can think of it as the zero-order diffraction going directly through your beam and just going directly to the center of your diffraction pattern. That ends up being a really big problem. And really, it boils down to the problem that your diffraction patterns have very large dynamic range. Okay, and this is something that you can see if you just take a natural image like Lena and you look at its Fourier transform and you look at the scale and magnitude of the amplitude of each of the different frequencies. The dynamic range is going to be 6 orders of magnitude. Okay, and that's a big problem for sensors. Sensors cannot sense 6 orders of magnitude, and when sensors become too saturated, it ends up, you get all sorts of blooming problems. You can run into problems with damage to the detectors themselves. So what is typically done is that a physical block, a baffle, is placed at the center of the detector to block that really intense zero-order diffraction through the X-ray sample. And so what this means is and so there's ways to get around this. Okay, so first off, the first thing that you can do is you can capture a bunch of images with different exposure times. Just this is the typical high dynamic range solution. Okay, capture multiple images. Each of those images captures a different portion of the dynamic range, and then you fuse those together. Okay, but there's problems. Radiation damage can be a problem in the sample. And you definitely can't do this in real time. So we were interested in this problem of how do you do these sort of experiments in a single shot. Okay, so you have a diffraction pattern, very large dynamic range. To mitigate the dynamic range, you put a baffle in the center. That's your measurements. Can you reconstruct objects from something like this? Okay, can you turn this into an image? And our approach to do that was to take so-called compressed sensing methods. And so this is essentially the model. Okay, so we have, on one hand, if we've got all of our data, okay, if our measurement here, so suppose we had access to complex measurements in this case, okay, so our measurement is just a Fourier transform of our data, and all we have to do is do an inverse Fourier transform to get the object back. That would be if we had actually measured the complex Fourier transform of the object, the complex diffraction, Fraunhofer diffraction pattern. We would just inverse Fourier transform it to get back the object. In our case, we have essentially a matrix blocking out some of the pixels of the Fraunhofer diffraction pattern. When we do an inverse Fourier transform, that's essentially a high-pass filter, which is essentially, if we tried to do an inverse Fourier transform, we would get an image that was essentially blurred by a high-pass filter function. Okay? So that's not the way to do the reconstruction. The right way to do the reconstruction is to look at this as essentially a missing data problem. So this matrix here, H, essentially tells us some of these pixels we're going to throw away. But we can do reconstructions from an incomplete set of measurements if we have appropriately set up priors. In this case, if we use a total variation priors, we can get certain guarantees that after we do this reconstruction, we can get a high-fidelity representation of the model. In our first implementation, we use a Fourier transform holographic setup. So in this setup, we have the equivalent of one or more reference beams, which is basically just a point source that is placed next to our object. So we have some sort of a biological sample, and we have some sort of a pinhole or multiple pinholes out at the edges of our scene. And then what we measure out here is the magnitude of the Fourier transform of the object plus the reference. And that, of course, is equivalent to if you expand terms, you get your DC terms or your autocorrelation terms, and then you get your copies of your object convolved with your reference. And if you want to do a reconstruction, you can just take your inverse Fourier transform, and you get multiple terms. And in this case, because you have sufficient, your holographic condition is ensuring that your reference points and your object are sufficiently far apart. What you get are multiple copies out at the edges of your object, and then you get an autocorrelation at the center. So this would be what a typical reconstruction from a Fourier transform type of geometry would look like. Okay. Now, if you have a beamstop, okay, then you measure the magnitude of the Fourier transform of the object plus reference multiplied by this matrix here, which tells you essentially which pixels that you're throwing away. Okay? And so if you try to do a reconstruction, each of these terms is convolved by this high-pass filter here. And in particular, what ends up happening is that you get a lot of ringing due to the interaction between the filter and the autocorrelation of your object. And it just looks like garbage, basically. Like these reconstructions look like total garbage. But if you just throw this constraint in here, where instead of doing just an inverse Fourier transform, you do this constrained optimization, where you're matching your data term, and you have a prior here which tells you that you shouldn't have essentially too much ringing in your results. Then you can get very nice reconstructions of your object terms. Notice that you're not getting a good reconstruction of the thing in the center. The thing in the center is supposed to be the autocorrelation of this image patch with itself. In this case, this is not a good accurate reconstruction of that, because basically this part in the middle doesn't follow this reconstruction model very well. But nonetheless, all we care about is this image patch out here, that it's reconstructed faithfully, and it's done very nicely using this technique. So here's emulation of this type of experiment using optical frequencies. So we have a very simple type of object, okay? And we're just going to measure the magnitude of the Fraunhofer diffraction, okay? And here's an example of the hologram that you get. So this is getting all the data, okay? And if you do an inverse Fourier transform, you get, you know, a good reconstruction of our object target here, this character phi. If you throw away some of the data, you get not a very good reconstruction. Whereas if you do a CS, you get a nice reconstruction. Here's a comparison between getting all the data, CS reconstruction with 14% of the missing data versus trying to do a brute force inverse Fourier transform with that same amount of missing data. Okay, so the second type of capture scenario that we looked at was just looking at so-called coherent diffraction imaging. So in this case, this is referenceless imaging. So in this case, the image that we measure is just take the Fourier transform of the object, look at its squared magnitude. That's what you get. There's no reference, nothing like that. That's it. Okay, and there's a lot of literature on how to solve this type of phase retrieval problem, and a lot of it has to do with essentially ensuring that you know that outside of some region, your object has no intensity value. So it has there's a support, so-called support constraints in these. And a popular method for solving the phase retrieval problem is the so-called hybrid input-output method from FINUP. And the idea here is that you come up with an estimate of your object. Okay, you just take a random guess. You look at its Fourier transform. And that Fourier transform should be the diffraction pattern that you measured. And you know what the intensity of the diffraction pattern was. So you replace the magnitude with what you measured. And then you look at the inverse Fourier transform. And you know that the inverse Fourier transform should be that object where outside of some region it should be all 0. So you enforce your object constraints. And you do it following some special rules. And then you just go back and forth and back and forth. And it works. It can work very well. It depends to a certain degree on how well the object, what type of objects you're imaging, but it can work very well. However, it does not work when you have missing data. Okay, so if you have a beam stop in your system so that you're blocking some of the light, okay, and you try to do a reconstruction, you'll get garbage. Some garbage. I mean, there's still a semblance of an image there, but you get some essentially low-frequency artifacts that are really distracting. So our idea is to apply this CS technique. However, the CS compressed sensing technique assumes that you have a linear model here, and we don't have a linear model. So our forward model has this quadratic here, which makes it difficult to directly plug into the CS model. However, there's a very interesting observation that you can make, which is that if you take that data, which has that missing low frequencies in it, and you try to do a reconstruction, you get this here. This gives you some kind of a reconstruction with some error in it. Okay? This is the ground truth. If you look at the Fourier transforms, and you look at the error in the Fourier transforms, it turns out that all of the error is concentrated in that region where you didn't have any measurements in the first place. So think about this as your detector plane. Okay, so this was your object. You looked at the Fourier transform. In the Fourier transform, you made a bunch of measurements. But in the center, you didn't make any measurements. Now we're looking at what are the errors as a function of position, essentially, on the detector. And they're all concentrated in the center where you didn't have any measurements. Okay? But there's very few errors everywhere else. So we have a faithful reconstruction for all of the high frequencies in our signal. And we just have lost all of the information for the low frequencies where we didn't have any measurements. It makes perfect sense. Okay? And so our idea is basically to use this as a mask. Once we've reconstructed using conventional HIO technique all of this high frequency information with very low error, now all we have to do is go back so now we have phase and intensity information at all of these locations, and now we can essentially apply the same CS reconstruction technique to solve based on those initial estimates for the data inside of this missing region in the same way that we did for the Fourier transform holography case. Okay? And it can work pretty well. So here's an example of just using conventional HIO to get an initial estimate. And then we know after we did that where all of our errors are constrained to be within. And then once we know that, we can do a conventional compressive sensing phase retrieval. And then it works pretty well for many different types of objects. So these are examples of different types of objects where this could potentially come in useful for. And our hope is now we're starting to get some data from actual experiments at the advanced photon source. And the next goal is to actually do some reconstructions with real captured data. OK. Should I spend a couple of minutes to explain one more project? OK. So that wraps up what I was planning to tell about. Again, the main thing here, different flavors, different diversity. On the one hand, looking at 3D scanning of macroscopic objects in outdoor settings. Okay. On the other hand, looking at 3D measurements and to a certain extent material characterization for art conservation projects. And then on the other hand, looking at X-ray diffraction problems. Okay. One more project I want to try to explain briefly is this project, which is a collaboration between Rice University and Northwestern. And the idea here is it's also a phase retrieval problem. In this case, we're trying to do high-resolution synthetic aperture imaging over long distances. Okay? And so the goal here is that we have a set of camera lenses, okay, a camera array, and the resolution of any one of the cameras in the array is going to be small. Okay, so if we're at a kilometer, the resolution might be, let's say, 100 centimeters. Okay, and so our goal is to stack up as many cameras as possible to create a synthetic aperture. Okay, so for instance, we have 10 cameras on the side, 10 by 10. We want to drop the diffraction limited resolution from 100 centimeters down to 10 centimeters. Okay, but the challenge here is that if we were doing holography, okay, then this would be possible, but we're not going to do holography. So we're not going to make interferometric measurements. Okay? However, we are going to illuminate with, we are going to illuminate with coherent illumination. Okay? And we're going to measure coherent diffraction patterns. We're going to measure only the magnitude of the diffraction patterns in each of the sensors. Okay? And then we're going to come up with an algorithm to do phase retrieval and synthetic aperture reconstruction simultaneously. Okay? So this is just a very high-level overview of what the project is. Again, the intention is to essentially build the equivalent of a very large aperture system from a set of modular components, smaller apertures, and synthesize a larger aperture computationally, using active illumination and specifically doing high-resolution imaging at long distances. So this is a remote sensing type of application that we're looking at. So we started out with our system using a camera on a stage. Okay, so we don't have a camera array yet. Okay? So right now we have a camera on a stage that we move around to a bunch of different positions. Okay? We have, in this case, we started out with a transmission mode. Okay? So we have an object right here. Okay? The object is far away from the aperture of the lens. So essentially what gets to the aperture of the lens is the Fraunhofer diffraction pattern. The lens essentially samples a portion of the Fraunhofer diffraction pattern, inverse Fourier transforms it, and maps it to an image on the sensor, which then we get an intensity-only measurement. Okay? So again, this is the model. Okay, we have an object. Our aperture is very far away from our object. So essentially, the plane of our aperture we can think of as essentially the plane of the Fraunhofer diffraction pattern of our object. And then the camera essentially captures a different portion of this Fraunhofer diffraction pattern, inverse Fourier transforms it, and we measure the squared magnitude of that. Yeah. And this is an example of some of the results that we're able to get with the system. Okay? So here so in this case, am I showing you how many images we're capturing? So this is, I think, 11 by 11 images. This is an example of an image that's captured from a single camera. Okay? And then this is an example of an image that's captured from our camera array. Okay? And again, the idea is that this is actually a transmissive object. So in this case, this is transmission mode. That's all we've demonstrated so far. So we have light going through, and we've essentially placed some talcum powder on a piece of glass and applied a fingerprint to it. And at those locations, the light is being absorbed. And we're essentially measuring the diffraction pattern of this absorbed intensity pattern from the fingerprint. And in this case, we are able to show, pretty clearly a 4x increase in resolution. And at the same time, we're also measuring the phase retardation due to that particular sample. Okay. So far we've demonstrated this in transmission mode and with a camera on a moving stage. But the goals moving forward with this are to switch over to reflection mode, deal with problems with diffusely scattering surfaces, looking at essentially speckle imaging. We've already started to look at this. We have some preliminary examples with that, and actually implement it on a camera array. Okay, so with that, I think that's a good time to wrap up, and I think it gives you a pretty good flavor of the kind of things that we're working on. And thanks for coming to my talk.
It's a great talk. I think if there are any questions, we can. Yes.